What is it like to exist in the liminal spaces of prison, or between prison and home, or in home as a prison? What kind of role does music play within these spaces, and what can we learn about it from songs that are written there? How can the concept of liminality, or the creation of alternative liminal states, help facilitate restoration between those returning after punishment and those who find it challenging to welcome them? As you may already know, we're now living in an era of mass incarceration and also mass supervision. Very large increases in the numbers of people in prison and on parole or probation, which is a hidden counterpart to mass incarceration. And these pose very practical problems. Reoffending rates have become a key political issue around the world. In the UK, where my study exists, 46% of all prisoners will reoffend within 1 year of release, and 60% of short sentence prisoners will reoffend in the same period. Prison reforms tend to focus on personal transformation of offenders, things that are done by or to an individual while they are in prison. However, research has repeatedly pointed to the role of social bonds, social support, social capital, and more broadly, social relations in desistance from crime. This means that a large part of the process of desistance from crime depends not solely on the individual, but on the actions and reactions of societies, communities, and institutions. Shad Maruna describes this. He says, "The released offender confronts at release a situation that virtually ensures his failure. The lethal combination of stigma, stereotyping, judgment, discrimination, social exclusion, being cut off from or cut out of mainstream society and opportunities, social learning, that's habits of thoughts and behavior that we have acquired from the people that we've been around, temptation, illegal opportunities that might come our way when legitimate opportunities are few and far between, addiction, lack of social bonds, so that would be close ties to family and friends and work and education, and dangerously low levels of human and social capital, not to mention financial capital, conspire to ensure that over half of all ex-prisoners typically return to prison within a few years of release." In other words, according to Fergus McNeill, who works with me on this study, reintegration is as much about the social spaces that we create for people and the social conditions that we cultivate as it is about individual people having changed or being ready for change. And therefore, some of the most important work in this area is not to change offenders, but to better engage wider society in the process of reintegration. This is the context in the UK into which this talk and the research behind it speaks. The context of prison, and particularly the space of return from prison, so that might be the imagined space of return, the moment of return, or the space of home as a prison, is extremely relevant to our theme this year, liminal. And today I wanted to look at 4 kinds of liminal spaces that we encounter in our work in the criminal justice system in the UK, and think about how exploring them helps us to better understand coming home after punishment, and the ways we might make it happen better. And I'm going to do this through the lens of 4 songs that have been written in different contexts as part of this research project. And I'll tell you just a little bit about that shortly. So, first of all, we'll look at prison itself as a liminal space, and we'll briefly consider the space between prison and home as a different kind of liminal space. Moving on, we'll explore musical and specifically songwriting spaces within prison and other prison-like settings as a temporary border space within, yet outside of the overarching institutional setting. And then finally, we'll look at the creation of liminal spaces for the purpose of restoration. So those would be spaces of dialogue, encounters between those related to the criminal justice system who seem at odds with each other. So that might be a victim and the person who harmed them. So Distant Voices Coming Home is a 3-year-long research project taking place in Scotland mainly, funded by the UK Economic and Social Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. As has been said, it pairs Scottish songwriters and musicians with people with experience of the criminal justice system, with the aim to explore, but also to practice reintegration through creative collaboration. We work alongside those currently within the criminal justice system, so that's people who are in prison, those having returned from it, the people who try to help others make that transition. So we work with probation officers, community workers, prison officers, and also those affected by issues with relation to crime, or those attempting to facilitate dialogue and restoration between them. Our research team is guided by Fergus McNeill from the University of Glasgow, Oliver Escobar from the University of Edinburgh, myself from the University of West of Scotland, and Alison Ury, who runs an organisation called Vox Luminous, who are our charity partner working within the sector. But it's guided and implemented by a larger team that includes those with lived experience of coming home. The songwriters on the project include Mercury Music Prize nominated C. Duncan, BBC Radio 2 Folk Musician of the Year Chris Drever, the Delgados, Emma Pollock, among others. The reasons for the use of songwriting in order to explore reintegration and assistance from crime are multiple. Firstly, we know that if you ask people interview questions or survey questions about a subject, they give you a certain type of answer. But if you ask them to sit down with you and write a song about something, you get a whole different kind of answer. You get emotional information, sonic information, bodily and visceral responses. And this is important because research shows that efforts to reform punishment and reintegration must take account of the very emotive and visceral aspects of our responses to crime. Furthermore, the act of collaborative songwriting itself is actively integrative on a number of levels. So writing a song with someone builds a relationship between the co-writers, it builds relationship between performers and audiences, and it integrates different aspects of the self. So the toe that wants to tap, and the mind that wants to think, and the body that wants to feel something. There's integration, internal integration. And finally, because although social and political issues tend to be explored by debate, this has been shown to lead to oversimplification, stereotyping, polarization, confrontation, disaffection, and exclusion. Dialogical approaches can work differently and lead to positive engagement in contested issues, and the sharing of songs has been shown to facilitate spaces of dialogue rather than debate. So the project's now completed 2 to 3 day songwriting sessions in a range of prisons in Scotland, including young offenders, women's prison, and open prison, and in community justice settings, as well as with victims and community groups, reaching well over 100 participants, and including the creation of over 200 original songs. We've released 1 album and 1 EP so far, with another EP release forthcoming in April. I'd now like to play you an example of one of the songs that's been created in the project. This song is called Everything's Spherical, and it was written by myself and Matthew, who is a young man serving out the end of his sentence in an open prison, awaiting release. His song, I think, speaks quite powerfully to the kind of liminal space that Matthew experiences the prison to be, and how he strives to maintain an authentic sense of identity within such a space. So here's Everything's Spherical. Would you prefer to see the lyrics as you listen, or only see them after you've heard the song? People have different feelings. While listening, okay. As long as you don't get bored once you've read the lyrics and I'm still droning on playing. Okay, we'll try that.
Everything's spherical. We were too small, climbing to be tall. No one's about this world to get shout. These fields are ours, but only for an hour or two. Will we feel this way of life again? to be something. Why can't we be nothing? Time to be artificial. Come stand on this bridge and be a giant. Come stand on this bridge and be Goliath. But you've never stood on a bridge like this before. You have, you've just forgotten. You've just forgotten. Whatever's happening has happened before. Whatever's happening has happened before. Whatever's happening has happened before. Come over here, join us in this wasteland. But you've never seen a wasteland like this before. You have, you've just forgotten. I remember this place from then. Time to climb again. Time to rhyme again. Why did we leave this free space back now? Just embrace everything spherical.
Thank you. So what kind of a liminal space is prison? Or the space between prison and an imagined or actual home? And what does this song tell us about that? First of all, we could spend a short time looking at what liminal means. Victor Turner is the theorist most widely credited with the use of this term. His work's been influential in... It's when the club starts now. He and his wife Edith had an important role in his work, which is as yet unrecognized. They used it to mean a threshold or in-between space. And he took the term from Van Gennep, who earlier described the 3 stages of rites of passage, like birth, marriage, and death. They described a preliminal separation or isolation from community, a liminal stage, where a person has an ambiguous non-status, neither dead nor alive, neither married nor unmarried, etc., and a post-liminal stage where a person is reincorporated into the community. Victor and his wife Edith focused on the liminal phase and described it as necessarily ambiguous, since this condition eludes or slips through the network of classifications that normally locate states and positions in cultural space. Liminal entities are neither here nor there. They are betwixt and between the positions assigned and arrayed by law, custom, convention, and ceremonial. So in Van Gennep's terms, we could look at prison as a liminal space, where people are isolated from their community and have a kind of non-status before they are reintegrated back into their communities. However, Turner's conception of the nature of the liminal space is very different than the character of the reality of prison spaces. Firstly, as Dominique Moran has observed, prisons are not total institutions, either not completely cut off from wider society. As Farrington documents, prison institutions have a relatively stable and ongoing network of transactions, exchanges, and relationships which connect and bind them to their immediate host community and to society more generally. Furthermore, for Turner, the liminal space is an unstructured space, a space of equality and intense community spirit, where subjects' differences in status and identity are subsumed and social groups are freed from the usual constraints of social structures. And this is certainly not the case in rigidly structured, hierarchical, status-driven, and hyper-constraining spaces of the institution of prison. That being said, many scholars reconceptualize the idea of liminality in a way that makes it applicable and useful to apply to prison spaces. Moran, for example, studies prison waiting rooms and discusses how, if we get rid of the idea of liminality as a space of linear transformation from one state to another, and allow that individuals might, for various reasons, become permanently identified with a state of betweenness from which they cannot emerge, it becomes a helpful descriptor for the kinds of spaces found in prisons. She describes how visitors to prison become liminal subjects, imprisoned temporarily and subject to similar and temporary prison constraints, but that they construct for themselves temporal identities that appear free from constraints and bring elements of outside or home into this space, set apart from the rest of prison life. They are therefore clearly states of betweenness and indistinction. Not only people in prison, but individuals on supervision in the community, some for the remainder of their natural life, describe feeling suspended between identities, not restored to their communities, but still continually held apart. And those considering being released from prison, or on the threshold of release, also describe the tensions of societal ideas of what a reintegrative identity should look like, and what their actual post-liminal identity is. For example, Turner's model assumes a wholehearted reintegration back into the community that the pre-liminal subject was removed from. However, much research shows that the majority of people in UK prisons could not have been said to have been integrated in those communities in the first place. For example, McNeill tells us that around the world, prisons are populated by the most disadvantaged people in society, much more likely to have been in care as a child, to have been unemployed, to have been excluded from school, to struggle with reading and writing. 65% of people in UK prisons have the numeracy skills of an 11-year-old, to have used drugs or suffered from at least 2 mental disorders. Furthermore, the sentences they receive, particularly imprisonment, often makes their disintegration worse. In Matthew's lyrics, which I'll put back up, we can very clearly see represented this idea of the liminal space and the ongoing struggle with the realities of post-liminal identity. He uses images such as the wasteland, which he contrasts with the fields that he describes as pre-liminal, or he talks about a bridge. And he points to the alienness of the space by telling us, you've never seen a way, you've never seen a wasteland, you've never seen a bridge like this before. He also talks about having to become artificial in the quest to become something required of him. As he wrote the song, it was clear to me, well, as we wrote the song, it was clear to me that he was under great pressure from social workers and those who would decide his readiness for release to present a model of himself as a particular kind of person with reformed values and behaviors. And this felt unnatural to him, particularly as it was required of him within the completely unnatural and inhumane environment of the prison. And he was on a quest to discover an identity that he felt was authentic to himself, but that would also satisfy society's requirements of him to be a rehabilitated individual. The way he does this is to try and remember a preliminal space where he did feel integrated with himself and with society. And where he finds this is in his rural upbringing and as a small child playing in the fields. His title line, "Everything's Spherical," combines the idea that he needs to come back to that original space, but from a different angle, with the comfort that he finds in the idea that however strange and alien an experience seems to him, this has happened to someone before and will happen again. This is a form of connectedness to humanity that is soothing for him in a situation that attempts to disconnect him. The invitation to come stand on this bridge with him was a turning point in my creative thoughts about the project as a whole. The bridge is such a liminal or threshold space. Indeed, the term liminal has now also come to signify specific spaces of betweenness, where a metaphorical crossing of some spatial and/or temporal threshold takes place. And that temporal threshold, I think, is represented in the sound that Matthew and I searched for in the writing of the guitar part and in recording the song. He cited Bon Iver, the first album, and Ben Howard, his early EPs, as his imagined influences for the song. And I was struck by how those references all came from the same era, quite a few years ago. And then by the realization that this may have been the year that Matthew arrived in prison and was allowed to choose his CD collection. They're allowed a maximum of 40 discs, so they have to make choices. So his musical references are suspended in time, as he is. In this song, Matthew so clearly invites us to stand in that liminal space with him and experience what it might be like to see the kind of wasteland that we've never seen before, but recognize within ourselves. This standing nearby to his experience is made possible in part because of the power of popular song to generate empathy in listeners. This line is also significant in my thinking because of the way in which we're coming to understand the role of songwriting in prison spaces as a form of bridging. As I said earlier, over 200 songs have been written in these liminal spaces as part of our project, and our research associate Phil Thomas has been analysing them as a collection. She says, "My engagement with the materials suggested two overarching categories, which are by no means mutually exclusive. One being songs that explore and rework memories through ordering them into a narrative structure, and one is songs that mediate relations both inside and outside of prison. In terms of the act of bridging, the second category of song is crucial. Songwriters in prison often want their songs to do something, and that frequently is to make a link, or to build a bridge, or to burn a bridge even, with someone or something important to their ability to come home after punishment, or just to survive it. We've begun to move beyond those thoughts about what kind of liminal spaces prisons create, and about what kind of bridges songs become in those spaces. And the reason for that shift comes largely from reaction to the next song I'm going to play you, a simple little song called Frank's Song. This was written by songwriter Rachel Samani and her co-writer Frank in a prison space. Rachel recounts that Frank was a very quiet man, and it was difficult to find common ground between them until they got talking about their love of playing the guitar and listening to Pink Floyd. And this is the song that resulted. Sorry, I need a tuner, I've just realized. The liminal space of tuning. Long hours, sore fingers, the melody lingers. First tune I write, glowing. Stiff wrist, Thanks. So Frank and Rachel's depiction of sunshine has been very compelling for lots of listeners. It's associated clearly here with the idea of music as helping us to a transcendent state, one that's independent of circumstances. The sunshine represents the joyfulness of performing music, getting the hang of it, and of being in the zone. It's a simple portrayal of the journey of learning an instrument, but transposed into the prison context in our imaginations, it becomes a song about the freedom from constraint that being lost in music can provide us. Many of our fellow researchers have described this role of music in their prison lives. For example, our co-researcher Sandy described listening to music and the shipping forecast, for example, on the radio, and it being like the sea was free to wash into his cell. But he also described playing Frank's song to friends of his, relatively recently released from prison, and their response to sunshine being that it was a dangerous space in prison, a moment of vulnerability, free from the hypervigilance that could result in becoming victimized. Turner would also describe a sunshine state as being part of liminality. He defines this as what he calls communitas. It's related to what Csikszentmihalyi would describe as flow, which is a heightened state of concentration when one's so intent on the activity at hand that all other thoughts, concerns, and distractions disappear, and the actor is fully in the present. The experience actually leads to a feeling of timelessness or being out of normal time and to feelings of transcending one's normal self. Further to that, in communitas, this is an activity that's done together, like drumming or singing together or concentrating on a collective task. Thomas Torino describes how during such an experience of communitas, the multiple differences among us are forgotten and we are fully focused on an activity that emphasizes our sameness of time, sense of musical sensibility, of musical habits, of spirit, and of common goals. This leads to joy and delight. And that these spaces can be created inside the constraints and structures of the prison brings to mind Bay's anarchic idea of the temporary autonomous zone. As songwriting facilitators, we recognize these characteristics from being present in the workshops that we run inside prisons. The equality, humility, absence of status, the delight in flow, and the sense of transition that Turner describes as part of liminal spaces are more often than not markedly present in the songwriting sessions we run, particularly when prison officers get involved and we have protected prisoners and unprotected prisoners being those who need to be protected from the rest of the prison population because of the nature of their crime. And we see what happens between those people in the space of a session. This is partly down to careful facilitation and setting up of the space by skilled community development and community music practitioners, and partly down to the action of music making and songwriting when that's done collectively. In that sense, Frank's Sunshine speaks to us of the liminality that songwriting and music making can bring to be present within the constraints and systems of prison life. There are critiques of the idea of communitas, one being that within prison structures, these might be used as part of reinforcement mechanisms, pacifiers. Another powerful critique is aimed at the idea that it's wholly positive to seek to lose your identity in the whole, with the aim of being more easily assimilated back into the community you've been dissociated from. In prison and in many other colonial contexts, there's a battle over who gets to tell a story and from which position. And resisting narrative incorporation is part of an important fight against colonialism and other forms of dominant power. And this may result in some people claiming the border space and purposely making a home in the ambiguous. This might mean resisting the communal sunshine in order to retain one's own narrative and avoid regurgitating enforced ones. So thinking about these kind of critiques, and thinking about Frank's song, I wrote a song called Regardless that draws on those, and I'll play that for you now. Thank you. I forgot to give you the lyrics. Here they are. So this was based in working with communities of musicians who had been going through the Me Too movement and talking to me about experiences they'd had of crimes that had robbed them of their sunshine of playing music. So this song asks, what does the opposite of Frank's sunshine sound like? And how do people who've had their sunshine negatively affected by crime respond to songs like his that allow them to relate to someone in Frank's position on an emotional level, but do so by asking them to connect via an experience no longer available to them? How can we create a dialogue between those coming home from prison and those receiving them by addressing difficult questions like that using music? The song also drew on lots of ideas around sunshine, like The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, Frank's reference being about mental health with relation to the music industries. And then, disappeared. And then the biblical verse that says, the sun shines on the righteous and the unrighteous, and the rain falls on the just and the unjust. So fundamental to what underlies this song is the question of how we yearn for forgiveness and restoration for or from or with people who have caused harm, but must also recognize the depth of harm that has been caused at the same time. And this returns me to the idea of the bridge. Which you probably can't see. Oh, yes, you can. That's fine. So it was for this reason that we began to consider the relevance of restorative justice, and this is the last little section that I'll give you here. Restorative justice is an alternative to what we might think of as retributive justice, which is common in justice systems around the world, the UK included. So current forms of justice are based on the following questions. What rules have been broken, who broke them, and what should be the consequence? Where restorative justice is based on moving towards these questions. Who has been harmed, what do they need, and who is responsible for meeting that need? It's predicated on the process of setting up a space where victims and offenders against those victims, in the presence of supporters and community, can come together, agree the nature of harm that's been caused, and then decide together how to respond to that harm. So in order to begin asking that question well, I set up a workshop with restorative justice practitioners in Belfast, and we played them different songs from the project that took different viewpoints, and asked them if they were to mediate between those two songs, what they would do. And we wrote some songs as a result of that, and I'd like to play you by way of concluding one of those. I think it represents a kind of liminal space that also exists in restorative dialogue encounters like those, and the kinds of bridges that can be built there. So here's a song called Resolution. This song has only just been completed, so you're the first people to hear it. Which is a blessing and also a curse, probably. Table as well as I could. Best guessed the order of chairs and measured the mood of the stopwatch carpet, sunflower drapes. I reread the stories, brushed up on the name. The want to be heard. Are you ready? We can do this anywhere you like. But there's
a place we can meet in with asking, with answering, a seat we can sit upon to be listened and to listen. Gave you a name when I was letting off steam. But there's no time to stop and think of how it weighs on me. One speaks to another, your worst to your best. That feeling doesn't have a word, doesn't have a name yet. The one to be heard. Are you ready? We can do this anywhere you want. There's a place we can live in with asking and answering, a seat we both sit upon to be listened and to listen. Don't you find sometimes it's hard to imagine beyond what is currently here? Don't you find sometimes it's hard to untangle lies that have wound themselves but we believe we can move from redacted, from flattened people to detail and resolution, filling the silences or leaving them.
Thank you. So to conclude, there are many types of liminal space we've discovered in criminal justice songwriting, and some of which are we'd call prefigurative. So they speak to us about a present that could be yet to come. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know if we've got time for questions because we started late. A few questions. If anyone has a question, please feel free to ask. There's someone over here. I think there's a microphone coming.
Okay. Thank you very much. I missed the first 10 minutes, your introduction,
Yes.
so I don't know. I was asking myself, why do you play those songs and why don't you play the recordings of the people who made it? That's one question. And just a remark, I don't know that 45 minutes is super short for such a huge topic, but the situation is super difficult. You pointed towards some things, but I thought it was super interesting, this being artificial in this one song, because I know people who research also in prisons, so that the situation, you can never tell the truth to the social workers or psychologist or whatever.
Yeah.
So I think this is a super difficult situation where music can definitely be helpful. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. And I think we're constantly aware. We have to have permission to go into prisons to do this work, and therefore we have parameters on what we can and can't do. And that some of our participants see us as part of that machine, and therefore the songs that they write with us are what we'd consider enforced narratives, like, I'm not the person I used to be, I'm a different person now. And it's interesting, it's hard to distinguish when that's happening. Although we do run sessions for people once they've come out of prison, so it's an ongoing community. We meet every Tuesday night and have dinner and write songs together with anyone who's come out of prison and wants to join us. And so we have different types of narratives that we can draw on from different situations of people who have come out and are no longer under supervision, for example. But we are constantly aware of that idea of enforced narratives, and of our songwriting helping to enforce those narratives further by giving it emotional weight. And in terms of whether to let people sing the songs themselves or recordings of them, it's a constant debate within the project and for the participants and our co-researchers. We've come to think of what we do as speaking nearby rather than speaking on behalf of. So because we're co-writers together, we see that as equal as possible. And a lot of writers would like us to sing the songs rather than them to sing them, because they feel they will have more resonance with a wider public that way, and they feel that their words, for example, are being more beautiful and more powerful as a result. But we do make recordings and encourage people to play or be a part of those recordings. They're in the studio when we make the recordings to be a part of it as much as they want to and are comfortable with. And I could have played the recordings, but there's a different thing about someone being present in a space and performing live than there is about pressing a button and hearing a disembodied voice. So there's pros and cons either way, but we do think about that a lot.
And one other question would be, are prisoners, while they are still in prison, allowed to have musical production equipment or instruments, something like this? And final question, do you have a publication or something coming out where you report about your findings? Or
Yes, there are a number of publications due in various different journals, but I consider my publications as the songs themselves. I do practice-based research, so I think of the songs as my research. So forthcoming albums and a performance called The Giant on the Bridge will be coming in April. But if you keep an eye on the website, so the Twitter feeds, you'll hear about that. It depends on the circumstance of the prisoner as to whether they're allowed those things or not. They're not allowed recording equipment of any kind. Some prisoners are allowed guitars, depending on their level of privilege or which type of prison they're in. There's a campaign in England at the moment to stop prisoners having instruments. And we have a new shift of government, as you may be aware, in which these freedoms may be withdrawn shortly. Great. Do we have time for one more question, or is that's us?
If there's any other question, yes, I think we have time for one more question. If not, maybe I can ask a question. I was just wondering now, as a research project, is there some kind of idea of how or what could come out of that on a practical level within that system? Is there an idea of how to implement that eventually or to continue in some ways?
Yes. So it's a collaborative action research project which suggests action, and all the products that we create are part of that action. But The Giant on the Bridge, for example, is a performance that is aimed at policymakers and the heads of the prison service in Scotland. We're fortunate in Scotland that we have a small prison service run within Scotland, and therefore people who really make decisions and make changes are accessible and will come to our events. And those are slowly becoming more political. as the project moves along. We don't force that agenda, it needs to come out of the project itself. We're setting up a series of workshops that work with journalists, for example, to consider how they represent these issues in the media, and we're working with magistrates to think about their sentencing decisions through the medium of writing songs together and thinking through the songs that have been written, and employers and other people who are part of welcoming people home from punishment. So it has a very practical base of using the songs to generate dialogue in places where change might be forthcoming. We don't have an agenda of exactly what the change should be, but we have a means by which we help people to think empathetically and humanely about what those changes should be within the system.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay, yeah,
Thank you,
Jo Collinson Scott, for this wonderful presentation and this wonderful work.